What if memory could lie to everyone at once? It began with a conversation in a quiet conference room in 2009. Fiona Broom, a paranormal researcher, casually mentioned a memory she was certain others would share: Nelson Mandela's death in a South African prison during the 1980s. She recalled the news footage, the global mourning, the televised speeches. But her words landed oddly in the room because Nelson Mandela was alive at the time. Released in 1990, he would go on to lead South Africa and become a symbol of peace and reconciliation. Yet, to Fiona's astonishment, others at the conference nodded in agreement. They remembered it too. Not just the idea of his death, but the specific details: funeral broadcasts, world leaders' reactions, even schoolroom discussions that had never occurred. This moment sparked what would become known as the Mandela effect, a term coined to describe collective false memories. Broom launched a website to document other instances, and what followed was an outpouring. Thousands of people from across the globe wrote in, each convinced they remembered the same event that never happened. It wasn't just Mandela. It was movie quotes, geography, brand logos, even world events. People remembered things that simply didn't exist, and they remembered them in identical detail. Psychologists joined the conversation. Researchers like Dr. Neil Dagnall from Manchester Metropolitan University found something peculiar. These memories weren't fuzzy or half-formed. They were vivid, consistent, and deeply emotional. When surveyed, nearly 20% of respondents believed Mandela had died in prison before being told otherwise. The false details weren't random either. They aligned. They made sense. They formed a coherent story. And yet they were wrong. Neurological research added another twist. Brain scans showed that false memories light up the same areas as real ones. To the person experiencing them, they are indistinguishable from truth. How is it that human minds, across countries and generations, could manufacture the same hallucination? It was as though reality had glitched and memory had taken a different path. A cultural mirror cracked quietly behind us, and no one noticed until we compared reflections. The Mandela effect wasn't about conspiracy or manipulation. It wasn't about rewriting history through force. It was something more intimate and more disquieting. It suggested that memory, the most personal record we have of the world, might not belong solely to us. That something shared, stories, emotion, culture, might overwrite what we think we know. This prologue sets the stage for a deeper journey. Through misremembered movie lines and vanished geography, through childhood books that changed their spelling and songs that ended differently than we recall. What if the real story is not about what was remembered incorrectly, but why so many of us remember it the same way? As we explore these 10 phenomena that rewrote history, not because they happened, but because millions believe they did, we'll face an unsettling truth. Memory is not a recording. It's a living thing, and sometimes it grows in strange directions. What else might we believe so deeply that never truly was? It started with a children's book, a simple story about a family of bears. For many who grew up in the 1980s and 90s, the Berenstain Bears were part of the furniture of childhood. But not the Berenstain Bears, the Berenstain Bears, with an E. Ask any adult who read those books, and most will recall the same spelling. Berenstain, pronounced Steen. They saw it on covers, said it aloud, and corrected others who got it wrong. And yet it never existed. The books were always titled Berenstain Bears, with an A. The authors, Stan and Jan Berenstain, never used any other spelling. Every book, video, and trademark since 1962 confirms it. But somehow, millions of people remember it differently. They remember owning books with the E. They remember the voices in animated shows calling them the Berenstain Bears. They remember it being so obvious it was never questioned. Surveys show that roughly 70% of adults who grew up with the books recall the incorrect spelling, and not passively. They insist on it. Some even report childhood arguments over it, now reversed. Parents tell their children it was Stein. The kids show them otherwise. How could this be? Psychologists suggest that our minds, especially when young, seek patterns and familiarity. Stein is a common suffix in many names: Einstein, Frankenstein, Goldstein. Stain, by contrast, feels odd, out of place in a name. Our brains may have unconsciously corrected the unfamiliar into something more expected. And when millions of minds do this in parallel, the result feels less like an error and more like a conspiracy. Even more unnerving is the emotional certainty. Adults who find their old books, ones they were sure, as said, Berenstain, feel disbelief, confusion, even betrayal. They're holding the same object they owned decades ago, yet it appears wrong. Some turn to elaborate theories, alternate timelines, dimensional shifts, quantum memory interference. But the truth may be both simpler and more profound. This is how memory works. Not as a perfect photograph of the past, but as a story rewritten every time it's recalled. Each retelling polishes the edges, smooths the inconsistencies, and locks in what should have been there. The Berenstain Bears aren't a glitch in reality. They're a mirror reflecting how we construct our histories not from facts, but from familiarity. In a world overflowing with information, this case reminds us that what we know from childhood may be a beautifully convincing fiction. So the question lingers: if we can all misremember the name of a bear family so clearly, what else have we rewritten without noticing? Mirror, mirror on the wall. It's one of the most quoted lines in pop culture, a phrase whispered by children, echoed in parodies, printed on T-shirts, and engraved into collective memory. Everyone knows who said it: the evil queen in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. She peers into her enchanted mirror, seeking reassurance of her beauty. But she never said it. In the original 1937 Disney film, the queen speaks a different line: "Magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" For millions, this revelation feels impossible. The wrong quote, "Mirror, mirror," is deeply rooted in memory. People swear they heard it, they saw it. They can mimic the cadence of the queen's voice as she says it. But when they re-watch the film, their memory collapses into confusion. It's not just unfamiliar, it's wrong. Surveys show over 85% of respondents remember the incorrect mirror, mirror phrasing. The discrepancy was first noticed in earnest around 2012, when internet discussions sparked a wave of disbelief. People dug out their childhood VHS tapes, expecting to prove the world wrong. But the tapes all said the same thing: magic mirror. So what's happening here? Part of the confusion stems from the original Brothers Grimm tale, where the phrase was mirror, mirror. Disney altered it, perhaps to sound more mystical, more lyrical, but that change, it seems, never truly landed in the public psyche. Over time, the simpler, more rhythmic version embedded itself in our culture. Mirror, mirror sounds more natural, more chant-like. It rolls off the tongue. It became the version echoed in cartoons, commercials, and pop culture riffs. This reinforcement created a feedback loop, where the incorrect memory was continuously confirmed by the world around us, and the brain complied. Recent research shows that auditory false memories can feel every bit as real as actual experiences. In brain scans, when subjects recall the line, "mirror, mirror," they show activity in the regions responsible for sound memory, as if they really did hear it. Their recollections are not passive assumptions. They are constructed experiences, rooted in feeling and familiarity. This phenomenon reveals something deeper than a misquoted movie. It shows how cultural repetition can sculpt memory, how media doesn't just reflect what we know, but tells us what to remember, and how. The Queen's line reminds us that our memories are often curated by culture, not carved in stone by fact. In the end, we must ask, when truth and memory part ways, which one do we trust? And what if the version that never existed is the one we remember most clearly? It ends with silence, unexpected, diminished. For decades, We Are the Champions by Queen has stood as a global anthem of triumph. Stadiums echoed with it. Movie endings soared on its final declaration. And almost universally, people remember the closing line, "We are the champions of the world." But listen closely to the studio version. That line never comes. The song simply ends with "We are the champions," and then nothing. No "of the world," no crescendo, just a fade. When this revelation resurfaced online in 2016, the reaction was immediate and disorienting. Millions insisted they remembered the ending clearly, some even claiming emotional memories tied to that final phrase. It was the line they sang at graduation, shouted during victories, cried to in private. Yet it isn't there. How could something so iconic vanish? Memory researchers, including Dr. Julia Shaw of University College London, have studied this exact phenomenon. What makes it extraordinary isn't just the scale. Over 80% of people familiar with the song remember the incorrect ending, but the emotional conviction behind it. These aren't vague or casual misremembrances. These are vivid, sensory-rich recollections. People can hear Freddie Mercury's voice. They remember the triumphant swell of music. Some even recall the exact note. So why does the ending feel real? It turns out "Of the World" is sung in the song, just not at the end. It appears earlier after the lyric, "No time for losers." But our minds crave closure. "Of the World" feels like the perfect bookend, a final note of victory. And over years of repeated listening, through live versions, parody, film, or personal imagination, our brains edit the memory to deliver what emotion demands. Live performances of the song, in fact, sometimes do end with that line. And these moments may have subtly overwritten the original memory for many. Layer by layer, the alternate version became more familiar until it eclipsed the truth. There's something profoundly human in that. We don't just remember facts, we remember feelings, and when the feeling of a song wants resolution, our memory gives it one. This case is more than a musical oddity. It's a reflection of how memory collaborates with expectation, how we sometimes craft reality not based on what was, but what should have been. In the end, this mass misremembering reminds us that the stories we tell ourselves about music, about moments, about life, are always part truth, part interpretation. So when we sing along, what are we really remembering? The song, or how it made us feel? And does it matter which version lives in our hearts, if it always felt like the truth? The photograph is frozen in time. A limousine gliding through Dallas, the President and First Lady waving to the crowd. But how many people were in the car? Ask most Americans, especially those over 50, and they'll tell you confidently. 4. President John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy in the back, with 2 Secret Service agents seated in front. It's the image taught in schools, shown in documentaries, etched into the public psyche. Except, it's wrong. The real limousine held 6 people. Along with the Kennedys were Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, seated in the middle row, and 2 front seat occupants, driver Roy Kellerman and Agent Sam Kinney. This configuration is visible in the Zapruder film, in photographs, in every piece of official evidence. So why do so many remember it differently? Psychologist Dr. James Lampin of the University of Arkansas found that around 40% of older Americans remember 4 passengers. When shown images of the actual 6-person car, many express disbelief or even suspicion, as if history itself had changed. The likely explanation lies in how traumatic events are processed. The assassination of JFK was a moment of national shock, raw, surreal, seared into memory not just as a news event, but as a collective emotional wound. In the face of such trauma, the mind simplifies. When the moment is recalled, the peripheral details fade. What remains is the emotional core, the president, the first lady, the horror of what unfolded. Governor Connolly and his wife, despite also being shot, are often mentally edited out. So too are the agents. The brain streamlines the scene for emotional clarity, placing focus only on what feels central. It's not deception, it's adaptation. Media played a role as well. Early coverage often zoomed in on the president's seat, cropping out others. Reenactments and dramatizations followed suit, reinforcing the narrower visual. Over time, this repetition created a new mental picture, one that felt more real than the complex truth. This phenomenon teaches us something sobering about memory, that even our clearest mental snapshots may be composites, shaped by emotion, media, and the passage of time. If we can misremember a moment so heavily documented, what else have we unconsciously rewritten? And in doing so, have we lost part of the story, not just of that day, but of ourselves? The car that carried a nation's heartbreak had 6 passengers. But in our collective memory, 2 have vanished, lost not to history, but to the way we choose to remember it. Look at a map. Really look. Where is South America? For millions around the world, the answer seems obvious. Directly beneath North America. Forming a neat vertical stack, the continents aligned like building blocks on a globe. That's how we drew it in school. That's how it looked in our minds. But the truth is stranger. South America isn't directly below North America. It sits far to the east, so much so that much of the continent lies east of Florida. On accurate world maps, the misalignment is striking. It's not a subtle shift, it's a continental tilt. This realization stunned educators in 2014 when geography teachers noticed a curious trend. Students, bright, well-taught students, consistently misplaced South America on blank world maps. But this wasn't simple ignorance. Adults did it too. The error was consistent, confident, and global. Dr. Sarah Cream-Reguer, a spatial memory researcher, dug into the data and discovered something startling. Over 60% of people share this same misperception, and it spans countries, languages, and education levels. People from North America, Europe, and Asia all show similar mental maps, maps that are objectively wrong. So how did we all get it so wrong? One culprit is the Mercator projection, the standard map used in classrooms and textbooks for generations. Designed for navigation, not accuracy, it distorts shapes and positions to fit a rectangular frame. And in that distortion, our mental image is formed. But projection alone doesn't explain it. The memories people describe are vivid. They speak of tracing the continents with fingers as children, imagining a straight line of travel from north to south. They felt the alignment. It wasn't a vague sense, it was certain. And that certainty reveals something deeper about memory. Our spatial recollections are not fixed snapshots. They're constructions, simplified, efficient, and emotionally reinforced. We group things that make sense together, even if reality disagrees. And over time, those simplified versions replace the truth. The implications go beyond geography. People have reported confusion when traveling, surprised that flight paths don't match their expectations. Even in the age of GPS, mental maps still guide how we think the world fits together. This isn't just about South America. It's about how confidently we can misremember something so foundational. The earth beneath our feet, the layout of our world, tilted in memory by just a few degrees, yet enough to create a false global truth. So the next time you look at a map, pause. Is what you see really what's there? Or is it what your mind has gently rearranged so the world makes just a little more sense? Even in geography, it seems, memory draws its own borders. The man stood alone, facing a line of tanks. It was June 1989, and the world was watching Tiananmen Square. In the aftermath of pro-democracy protests in Beijing, a lone figure, white shirt, shopping bags in hand, stepped into the path of armored vehicles. Cameras captured the moment. It became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, fragile resistance against unstoppable force. But how does the story end? Ask around, and many will say the same thing. The tanks ran him over, crushed him. It was horrifying, unforgettable. Some claim to have seen it on the news. Others recall crying when it happened. They remember the moment with clarity and emotion. And yet, it never occurred. In every known version of the footage, the tanks stop. The man climbs briefly onto the lead vehicle. They wait. Eventually, he steps aside, alive. This contradiction between reality and recollection has baffled researchers. In 2014, during anniversary coverage of the protests, online conversations lit up with disbelief. People insisted they had seen the man's death with their own eyes, on television, in class, with friends. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a leading authority on false memory, investigated the tank man phenomenon and found something remarkable. Not only do people remember the non-existent death, they recall vivid emotional responses to it. The grief, the shock, the outrage. It wasn't a passing thought, it was seared into identity. How can so many remember something so specific and so wrong? One explanation lies in emotional expectation. The broader context of Tiananmen was brutal. Hundreds were killed in the government crackdown. In that climate, seeing the tanks roll forward feels like what should have happened. The peaceful resolution clashes with the brutality of the moment, so the mind resolves the dissonance by altering the narrative. Memory, once again, chooses coherence over accuracy. Brain scans support this idea. People recalling the false version show activity in trauma-associated regions, as if reliving an actual tragedy. The memory feels real, because emotionally it fits. Media may have played a role too. In the rush of early coverage, stories of violence swirled, images blurred together. Over time, reenactments, dramatizations, and even symbolic artwork may have cemented a version of events that never occurred. The Tank Man reminds us that even history's most iconic images are vulnerable to distortion, not in the footage, but in us. If we can remember a death that didn't happen, what else have we memorialized that never was? And in changing the ending, did we change what the image means? Perhaps the greatest threat to truth isn't censorship, it's memory's quiet, unquestioned edits. He wears a top hat, a cane, and a smile filled with charm. The Monopoly Man, Rich Uncle Pennybags, has been a cultural icon for over 8 decades. From family game nights to Halloween costumes, he's instantly recognizable. Tuxedo, mustache, and a monocle. At least that's how most of us remember him. But here's the twist. He never wore one. In every version of the game's artwork, from its 1935 debut to the present, the Monopoly Man has never been depicted with a monocle. No official box, rulebook, or token features it. Yet if you ask people to describe him, or better yet, draw him from memory, over 80% include the monocle without hesitation. So where did it come from? The explanation at first glance seems simple: visual association. The monocle has long been a symbol of wealth and old-world elitism. Characters like Mr. Peanut, who does wear one, fit that image. So when our minds picture a rich, mustachioed gentleman, they supply the accessory automatically. But this isn't just assumption, it's memory. People report specific recollections of the monocle, its glint, its chain, the way he adjusted it. Some describe learning the word monocle because of him. Others insist they remember it clearly from childhood game sessions, right there on the box lid. Dr. Kimberly Wade, a psychologist studying character-based memory distortions, suggests something deeper is at work. Our brains don't store perfect images. They store impressions, fragments linked by emotion, repetition, and story. When those fragments are culturally reinforced, they become reality in our minds. And the Monopoly Man's monocle became just that, a reality. The false image is everywhere, in parodies, in cartoons, in comedy sketches. The monocle has become so entrenched that seeing the real artwork without it feels incomplete. People assume the current version is a redesign, an updated, modernized take. But it's not. It's always been monocle-free. This phenomenon reveals how easily culture can overwrite truth, how quickly a collective misremembering becomes a visual fact, and how confidently we can describe something we've never actually seen. It raises uncomfortable questions. If something as visible as a board game icon can be so universally misremembered, what about the subtler things? The headlines, the faces, the fleeting details of everyday life. Memory doesn't need reality to feel real, so next time you pass by a Monopoly box, take a second look. Not to correct the image, but to marvel at the version your mind has always carried. Sometimes, the most vivid memories are the ones we never truly saw. A wicker horn, overflowing with fruit, a symbol of abundance, of harvest, of childhood routines. For decades, people remembered the fruit of the Loom logo as exactly that. Apples, grapes, leaves, and nestled behind them, a cornucopia. Brown, curved, and unmistakable. Except it never existed. Throughout the company's 170-year history, in every official logo and trademark filing, the cornucopia is absent. The fruit is there, but the horn is not. Still, ask millions who wore the brand's underwear or undershirts growing up, and they'll tell you otherwise, in detail. They remember the shape, the texture, the specific shade of brown. Some recall learning the word cornucopia because of that image. It wasn't a vague association. It was a visual education. When online discussions brought this to light in 2019, the disbelief was palpable. People rifled through old clothes, searched vintage catalogs, even visited thrift stores, but every tag, every package, confirmed the truth. The cornucopia was never there. So how can we all remember it? Dr. Carol Laney, an expert in memory and commercial imagery, studied the case and uncovered a pattern. The cornucopia isn't just a symbol, it's a visual metaphor deeply embedded in cultural memory. It's what people expect to accompany overflowing fruit. It completes the picture. And when that expectation is reinforced over years of use, our brains oblige. They fill in the missing horn. This kind of memory isn't lazy, it's elegant. It reflects how the brain makes meaning, not just records details. When something should be there, especially when tied to emotion or repetition, memory supplies it with confidence. Even more compelling is the consistency of the error. Most people who remember the cornucopia describe the same version, down to its position and tilt. These aren't random misfires. They're shared constructions, born from pattern recognition and cultural suggestion. And they persist. To this day, parody products, memes, and even homemade art continue to include the non-existent cornucopia. It has become the real logo in the public imagination, more familiar than the official version, more emotionally authentic than any registered trademark. This case reveals just how fluid memory can be, even with something as seemingly mundane as a clothing label. It's not just what we see, but what we expect to see that leaves an imprint. So the next time someone mentions the Fruit of the Loom logo, you might hesitate. You might remember that curved horn, and you'll realize, even when the truth is plain, the memory can be louder. What else have we remembered? Not because it was there, but because it fit? Hello, Clarice. It's one of the most famous lines in film history. Or at least, that's what millions of people believe. The chilling voice of Hannibal Lecter. Whoa, boy. A quiet greeting to the young FBI agent, iconic in its sinister calm. But Anthony Hopkins never says it. In The Silence of the Lambs, his first words to Clarice Starling are, in fact, "Good evening, Clarice." The line, "Hello, Clarice," does not appear anywhere in the film. Yet when asked, roughly 75% of moviegoers recall the wrong version, and with precision. They can imitate his tone, the pause, the cadence, the exact inflection of the words. The effect is disorienting. Re-watching the scene often produces shock. How can so many people remember something so vividly that never occurred? Dr. Lynn Natal studied the phenomenon, focusing on how emotional and cultural cues shape memory. The "Hello, Clarice" misquote has seeped into pop culture so deeply that it now dominates references, parodies, and discussions about the film. TV shows, comedy sketches, Halloween costumes all reinforce a line that was never spoken. The brain, it seems, prefers a simplified, emotionally satisfying version. Hello feels like a natural greeting, immediately understandable. Good evening is formal, precise, slightly jarring in contrast to our cultural expectation of the scene. Over decades, the repeated paraphrasing and imitation created a false but compelling memory, one that now feels more authentic than reality. People don't just misremember the words, they misremember the experience. The audio-visual memory, including Hopkins' exact pronunciation and timing, has been altered by repetition and expectation. Their minds have created a perfect simulation of a scene that never existed. This phenomenon highlights the delicate interplay between memory, culture, and emotion. Iconic lines are not just linguistic units, they are emotional touchstones. And when the emotional expectation diverges from reality, memory edits itself, leaving the audience convinced that fiction has been recorded as fact. It's a quiet reminder that even in the realm of art, where every frame is controlled, collective memory can rewrite the narrative. Millions can be certain of a line that never existed, and in their minds, it's as real as if it were. Perhaps the question isn't why we misremember, but why the misremembered line feels so undeniably true. The photograph is familiar, a mirror reflecting the past, yet subtly askew. It's the image of Nelson Mandela, the Berenstain Bears, the Queen's Mirror, the Tank Man, the Monopoly Man, Freddie Mercury, South America on a map, and the JFK limousine. Each is a singular instance, but together they reveal a pattern, a collective memory that diverges from documented reality. The phenomena have names now: the Mandela effect, false memory syndromes, collective misremembering, but the essence remains mysterious. How can millions of people recall events, images, and lines with identical detail that never occurred? Psychology offers some answers. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Every recall is a reassembly of fragments influenced by culture, emotion, and expectation. Trauma, repetition, linguistic rhythm, visual patterns, all these factors shape what we retain and what we discard. Familiarity often replaces accuracy. Emotion strengthens the imprint, even if the event itself is misremembered. And when millions experience similar cultural exposures, the false memory becomes shared, a collective truth that feels real, even when it isn't. Neurological research supports this. False memories activate the same brain regions as true ones. Confidence is indistinguishable. The mind doesn't know it's erring. It believes in the reality it constructs. Our brains fill gaps with what is expected, logical, or emotionally satisfying, and over time, these reconstructions harden into memory. The cultural reinforcement magnifies the effect. Misremembered movie lines, logos, and song lyrics propagate through media, jokes, merchandise, and discussion. The world constantly validates the false recollection, embedding it further. Reality is no longer measured by historical records alone, but by what society collectively remembers. These distortions are not trivial. They reveal a fundamental truth about consciousness. Reality is not a fixed record, but a fluid narrative, co-authored by mind and culture. What we believe we saw may not have happened, and yet the memory shapes identity, perception, and behavior. Faced with this, the question arises: if our memories can be collectively wrong about the past, how reliable is our sense of reality itself? If we trust memory above evidence, do we trust history or the story we've collectively constructed? Perhaps the true mystery is not the events we misremember, but why these memories feel more real than the facts they contradict. It challenges us to reconsider how we know the world, and whether certainty is ever anything more than a shared illusion. Across decades and continents, patterns emerge in the strange terrain of human recollection. Movie quotes misremembered, logos reshaped, continents shifted in our minds, songs ending differently than recorded, historical events condensed or rewritten. All these instances share a common thread: the mind's relentless drive for coherence and meaning. We prefer narratives that satisfy expectation, emotion, and cultural familiarity over raw, uncurated fact. Consider the snow-white mirror, the fruit of the Loom cornucopia, or the Berenstain Bears. These are small, everyday details, yet they persist in memory with astonishing consistency. Why? Because memory is less a filing cabinet and more a storybook. Each recall is a retelling, subtly edited by context, prior knowledge, and social reinforcement. When millions share similar contexts, the retelling synchronizes across minds, creating collective misrememberings that feel indisputably real. Even high-stakes events like JFK's limousine or the Tank Man illustrate the same principle. Emotional intensity amplifies memory, but not always accurately. The mind streamlines, dramatizes, and simplifies trauma, emphasizing what seems central while discarding peripheral details. Repeated exposure through media, conversation, and personal reflection cements these reconstructions, embedding false details into a network of shared cognition. Neurological studies reveal another layer. False memories activate the same brain regions as authentic memories. Confidence, clarity, and emotion are not reliable markers of truth. What feels vivid and real may be a carefully orchestrated simulation within the brain, influenced by expectation and culture. Yet these phenomena are not simply curiosities, they are lessons. They remind us that human consciousness is an active participant in the construction of reality. Memory is creative, not passive. Our shared recollections, even when inaccurate, shape culture, identity, and decision-making. Perhaps most striking is the psychological comfort in misremembering. False memories often satisfy emotional or narrative needs more effectively than reality. A triumphant song ending, a dramatic movie line, a conveniently aligned continent all feel right because they complete the story our minds want to tell. This understanding reframes our relationship with history and culture. Reality and memory are entwined in a dance of perception, expectation, and imagination. To navigate the world, we rely on memory, but that reliance carries uncertainty, subtle, pervasive, and deeply human. And so we confront a profound question. If collective memory can be so compellingly wrong, what can we truly know? These false memories are more than errors. They are narratives we have co-authored across time and space. When millions recall Nelson Mandela's death in prison, the Queen saying, "Mirror, mirror, the Monopoly man sporting a monocle," or South America hanging directly beneath North America, they aren't imagining loosely or guessing. They are experiencing lived recollections with details, sounds, emotions, and conviction. The consistency across individuals suggests a process far more systematic than mere coincidence. Memory shaped by expectation, culture, and repetition, crystallized into collective experience. History and culture become intertwined in these phenomena. A song lyric remembered differently, A logo embellished in imagination, a childhood book misread for decades. Each instance reflects the brain's way of constructing a cohesive, meaningful world. Emotional resonance, social reinforcement, and cognitive shortcuts reinforce these constructions, making them feel real. They are, in essence, collective storytelling, fictions that function as memories, intertwined with identity, nostalgia, and cultural consciousness. Yet these stories, though false, are not harmless illusions. They shape understanding, influence behavior, and even affect decision-making. They reveal how the human mind prioritizes coherence, emotional satisfaction, and shared experience over precise accuracy. We are not merely observers of reality. We are its active architects, sometimes rewriting it without realizing. In examining these shared false memories, we confront an essential paradox. Truth is both more fragile and more malleable than it appears. Memory, the very tool we rely on to navigate history and life, is creative, adaptive, and at times unreliable. The phenomena do not merely highlight mistakes, they illuminate the profound complexity of consciousness itself. And in recognizing the patterns of these collective misrememberings, we are invited to reflect. Perhaps the stories we hold most dear, the recollections that feel most certain, are as much about who we are and who we want to be as they are about what actually happened. Our memories may not be flawless records, but they are our truths, crafted, shared, and perpetually evolving. And in understanding this, we begin to see human experience itself as a living, collaborative tapestry of perception, imagination, and meaning. We reach the end of our journey through the strange, haunting landscapes of collective memory. From Mandela's imagined funeral to the misaligned continents, from misquoted lines in films to logos and songs remembered differently, the threads converge into a single realization. Memory is not a mirror, It is a canvas painted by emotion, expectation, and culture. What we believe we have seen, heard, or experienced is often a co-creation, part reality, part imagination, part shared narrative. This is not to diminish memory's value. Its flexibility allows learning, creativity, and social cohesion. But it is a cautionary tale. Even the most vivid, most confident recollections can be constructs. Our brains and the cultures that surround them are storytellers above all. They fill gaps, smooth edges, and create continuity, even if it diverges from historical fact. Perhaps the most profound insight is humanistic. False memories tell us about our needs, fears, and desires. We misremember what is emotionally resonant, culturally reinforced, or narratively satisfying. We reconstruct our histories to make sense of them, to connect with others, to find meaning. Memory, then, is as much about who we are and who we want to be as it is about what truly happened. And in that light, these Mandela effects, these collective illusions, are not failures. They are reflections of consciousness itself, dynamic, interpretive, creative. They show the beauty and fragility of the mind, its capacity to imagine, to empathize, to co-author shared realities. So we are left with a question both simple and profound. If reality can be reshaped in memory, what is the measure of truth? Is it the documented fact or the remembered experience that has shaped millions of hearts and minds? The answer may not be absolute. Perhaps it is not in the precision of facts, but in the humanity of remembrance, our capacity to believe, to feel, and to create shared meaning from the ephemeral threads of experience. In the end, memory is not merely a record of life. It is life itself, recalled, reshaped, and reverberating through the collective soul of humanity.